Captain Sarah Mitchell gripped the controls of her AH-64 Apache helicopter as it cut through the morning sky over the desert terrain. The landscape below stretched endlessly, a canvas of brown and gold that had become as familiar to her as her own backyard. She had been flying combat missions for 3 years now, but today felt different. There was an electric tension in the air that made her muscles tighten despite her years of training. Her co-pilot and gunner, Lieutenant Jake Rodriguez, sat in the front seat below her, his eyes scanning the horizon through his targeting system. They had been partners for 18 months, and their communication had evolved into an almost telepathic understanding. Jake's steady breathing through the headset was reassuring, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone in this steel bird flying at 150 miles per hour. The mission briefing had been routine enough. Intelligence reports suggested enemy movement in the valley ahead, and their job was to conduct reconnaissance and provide close air support if needed. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was the growing feeling in Sarah's gut that something was about to go very wrong. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now they were screaming danger. Sarah had grown up in a small town in Montana, where her father ran a crop dusting business. She had been flying since she was 14, starting with her dad's old Cessna and working her way up through every aircraft she could get her hands on. The military had been a natural choice, offering her the chance to fly the most advanced helicopters in the world while serving her country. The Apache had been love at first sight, a flying tank that could dance through the sky like a ballerina while carrying enough firepower to level a city block. The radio crackled to life, breaking her from her thoughts. Command was updating their mission parameters, directing them toward a suspected enemy position about 15 miles northeast of their current location. Sarah acknowledged the transmission and banked the Apache toward the new coordinates, feeling the familiar sensation of the aircraft responding to her touch like an extension of her own body. As they approached the target area, Jake began his preliminary scans. The terrain below was rough and mountainous, providing countless hiding spots for enemy forces. Sarah maintained their altitude at 2,000 feet, high enough to avoid most small arms fire, but low enough for Jake to get accurate readings on potential targets below. "I'm picking up heat signatures," Jake reported, his voice calm and professional, despite the significance of his discovery. Multiple vehicles approximately 8 clicks ahead, partially concealed under camouflage netting. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly, but her hands remained steady on the controls. This was what they had trained for, what they had been preparing for through countless hours of simulation and practice runs. She began a wide circle around the suspected position, allowing Jake to gather more detailed intelligence while keeping their Apache at a safe distance. The desert sun was climbing higher now, creating heat shimmer that made the landscape below dance and waver. Sarah had to rely more heavily on her instruments and Jake's thermal imaging to navigate accurately. The Apache's systems hummed around them, a complex symphony of electronics and mechanics that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Through her headset, she could hear chatter from other aircraft in the area. 2 F-16 fighter jets were providing top cover about 10,000 feet above them, and another Apache crew was operating about 20 miles to the south. The knowledge that friendly forces were nearby provided some comfort, though Sarah knew that in combat, you were ultimately responsible for your own survival. Jake's voice came through the headset again, more urgent this time. "I'm counting at least 6 vehicles down there, and I'm seeing personnel movement. Looks like they're setting up some kind of equipment, possibly anti-aircraft systems." Sarah's blood ran cold. Anti-aircraft systems meant that their Apache, for all its armor and advanced systems, had suddenly become a high-priority target. She immediately began evasive maneuvers, varying their altitude and direction while Jake continued his reconnaissance work. The terrain below offered both opportunities and dangers. The rocky outcroppings and steep valleys could provide cover if they needed to break contact quickly, but they also limited her maneuvering options and created potential ambush points. Sarah made mental notes of possible escape routes while maintaining her surveillance pattern. As they completed another pass around the target area, Jake reported more disturbing news. "Sarah, I'm seeing what looks like a mobile SAM site. They're definitely setting up to engage aircraft, and I think they've spotted us." The confirmation of surface-to-air missiles changed everything. Sarah immediately contacted command to report their findings, speaking in the clipped, professional tone that was drilled into every military pilot. The response was swift. They were to maintain visual contact with the enemy position while additional assets were moved into the area. But as Sarah acknowledged the order, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Far below, she could see the distinctive flash of sunlight reflecting off metal as the enemy position adjusted their equipment. They weren't just setting up defensive positions, they were actively tracking the Apache's movement. Jake confirmed her worst fears. "They're painting us with radar. We're being targeted right now." Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She dropped the Apache's nose and began a series of sharp turns designed to break the radar lock while simultaneously gaining speed. The helicopter shuddered and strained under the sudden maneuvers, but responded beautifully to her commands. The peaceful morning reconnaissance mission had just turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Sarah and Jake playing the role of the mouse. Below them, enemy forces were preparing to turn their Apache into a falling ball of fire and twisted metal. But Sarah Mitchell hadn't survived 3 years of combat flying by being easy prey. As the first warning tone sounded in their cockpit, indicating that missiles were being prepared for launch against them, Sarah felt something unexpected happen. Instead of fear or panic, a strange calm settled over her. She had trained for this moment her entire career. And now it was time to prove that an Apache pilot doesn't go down without a fight. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions from command and other aircraft in the area. But Sarah's focus was entirely on the sky around her, and the deadly dance that was about to begin. The missile warning system screamed to life, filling the cockpit with urgent electronic alerts that would have terrified most people. But Sarah Mitchell had heard these sounds in training hundreds of times, and her response was automatic and precise. She threw the Apache into a violent diving turn to the left while simultaneously deploying countermeasures, metallic chaff, and infrared flares designed to confuse incoming missiles. Jake's voice cut through the electronic chaos, calm despite their desperate situation. "2 missiles in the air coming up fast from our 6 o'clock position." Sarah could see the missiles' smoke trails in her peripheral vision as she pushed the Apache through maneuvers that tested both the aircraft's limits and her own physical endurance. The helicopter groaned and shuddered under the extreme forces, but held together as she had known it would. The Apache was built for exactly this kind of punishment. The first missile streaked past them, fooled by the chaff cloud Sarah had deployed just seconds earlier. She felt a moment of satisfaction, but it was short-lived as Jake reported the second missile was still tracking them. Closing fast despite her evasive maneuvers, Sarah pulled the Apache into an even tighter turn, feeling the G-forces press her deep into her seat. Her vision began to tunnel slightly from the stress on her body, but she maintained focus on the aircraft's controls and the terrain rushing past below them. She was flying the helicopter at the very edge of its performance envelope, using every trick she had learned in 3 years of combat flying. The second missile exploded just 50 feet behind them, close enough that the shockwave rocked the Apache violently from side to side. Sarah fought to maintain control as debris from the explosion peppered their aircraft's armored hull. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel, but nothing critical had been hit. They were still flying, still fighting. Jake was already acquiring targets below, his calm professionalism never wavering, despite the fact that they had just escaped death by a matter of seconds. "I have multiple targets," he reported, requesting permission to engage. Sarah contacted command for clearance while continuing her evasive flight pattern. The radio was busy with traffic from other aircraft converging on their position, but she managed to get through to the command post. Permission to engage was granted immediately, along with the news that F-16 fighter jets were inbound to provide additional support. But the enemy wasn't finished with them yet. Jake reported more missile launches from the ground, and Sarah realized they were facing a much larger and better equipped force than intelligence had suggested. This wasn't just a small patrol or reconnaissance unit. This was a serious military operation with sophisticated anti-aircraft capabilities. Sarah made a split-second decision that would have seemed crazy to anyone watching from the ground. Instead of continuing to run from the missiles, she turned the Apache directly toward the enemy position and began a high-speed attack run. It was a move born of desperation and tactical brilliance in equal measure. The logic was simple but dangerous. By closing the distance to the enemy position rapidly, she was making it harder for their missile systems to track and engage the Apache effectively. Most surface-to-air missiles were designed to engage targets at medium to long range, and her aggressive approach was putting them inside the optimal engagement envelope. Jake understood her plan immediately and began lining up targets in his sights. The Apache's 30mm cannon came online, and its Hellfire missile system was armed and ready. They were transforming from hunted prey into a hunting predator in a matter of seconds. The enemy position erupted in activity as the Apache bore down on them. Sarah could see personnel running between vehicles and equipment, trying to relocate their anti-aircraft systems to continue engaging her helicopter, but she was moving too fast and too unpredictably for them to get a solid lock. Jake opened fire with the 30mm cannon, sending a stream of high-explosive rounds into the enemy position. The accuracy was devastating. Vehicles exploded in brilliant fireballs as the cannon rounds found their marks. Sarah maintained the attack run while constantly varying their altitude and direction to avoid giving the enemy an easy target. More missiles launched from the ground, but Sarah was ready for them this time. She had positioned the Apache so that the rocky terrain provided natural cover, and she used the landscape to her advantage by diving into valleys and popping up over ridgelines in unpredictable patterns. It was like playing three-dimensional chess at 200 miles per hour while people were shooting at Phew! The radio crackled with excited chatter from the F-16 pilots who were watching the engagement from above. Apache 1-7, that's some incredible flying down there, came the admiring voice of one of the fighter pilots. But Sarah wasn't flying for admiration. She was flying for survival. Another missile streaked past the Apache, close enough that she could feel the heat wash from its exhaust through the helicopter's armor. The enemy was getting lucky shots, and she knew their luck couldn't hold out forever. Jake fired a Hellfire missile at what appeared to be the command vehicle for the enemy anti-aircraft unit. The missile streaked away from the Apache with deadly precision, guided by Jake's laser designation system. 2 seconds later, the target erupted in a massive explosion that sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. The destruction of the command vehicle seemed to disrupt the enemy's coordination, and their missile launches became less frequent and less accurate. Sarah pressed her advantage, bringing the Apache around for another attack run, while Jake identified additional targets. But as they completed their turn, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. More vehicles were moving into the area from the north, reinforcements that could turn the tide of the battle back against them. The enemy force was larger than anyone had anticipated, and she and Jake were about to find themselves outnumbered and outgunned. The F-16s above them were running low on fuel and would need to return to base soon. Once the fighter cover was gone, the Apache would be alone against a growing enemy force with sophisticated anti-aircraft capabilities. Sarah began calculating their options while continuing to dodge missiles and return fire. It was then that something completely unexpected happened. As Jake launched another Hellfire missile at an enemy vehicle, Sarah heard a sound that she would remember for the rest of her life. Over the radio, cutting through all the military chatter and electronic noise, came the sound of laughter. Clear, feminine laughter that seemed completely out of place in the middle of a deadly air battle. At first, Sarah thought it might be a malfunction in their radio system, or perhaps crosstalk from another channel. But the laughter continued, and it seemed to be coming from someone who was watching their battle and finding it amusing rather than terrifying. Jake heard it too, his confusion evident in his voice as he asked, "Sarah, are you picking up that transmission?" The laughter was followed by a woman's voice speaking in accented English. "Very good flying, Apache pilot. But the real test is just beginning." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine despite the heat of battle. Someone was watching their fight. Someone who seemed to know exactly what was happening and what was about to happen next. The voice had a quality of confidence that suggested whoever was speaking knew something that Sarah and Jake didn't. As if summoned by the mysterious voice, Sarah's threat warning system suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree. New missile signatures were appearing on her screen, more than she had ever seen in a single engagement. The reinforcements that had been moving in from the north weren't just bringing more troops. They were bringing enough firepower to turn the Apache into scrap metal. The mysterious woman's laughter echoed through Sarah's headset again, more pronounced this time, as if she was enjoying a private joke that only she understood. Sarah tried to focus on the immediate threat of the incoming missiles while simultaneously trying to identify the source of the transmission. The voice didn't match any of the call signs in their operation, and the accent suggested someone who wasn't part of their allied forces. Jake's voice was tense, as he reported what his instruments were showing. "Sarah, I'm counting 8 new missile signatures coming from multiple directions. This isn't random. They're coordinating a simultaneous attack designed to overwhelm our countermeasures." Sarah's mind raced through their options. 8 missiles coming from different angles meant that her usual evasive maneuvers wouldn't be enough. She needed to do something completely unexpected, something that would confuse not just the missiles but the people controlling them. The Apache was tough, but it wasn't invincible, and even one successful hit could bring them down. The mysterious voice came through the radio again, clearer this time. "Captain Mitchell, your reputation precedes you. 3 years of successful missions, 57 combat hours, and not a single aircraft lost under your command. Impressive statistics, but statistics mean nothing when faced with superior planning." The fact that the unknown woman knew Sarah's name and service record sent ice through her veins. This wasn't a random encounter. They had been specifically targeted by someone who had done their homework. Sarah realized that this entire engagement might have been a trap designed specifically for her and her crew, but there was no time to dwell on the implications. The missiles were closing fast and Sarah had to make a decision that would either save their lives or end them. She pushed the Apache into a steep dive toward the rocky terrain below, aiming for a narrow canyon that appeared on her navigation display. It was a desperate move that would either provide cover from the missiles or turn them into a crater in the desert floor. Jake understood her plan immediately and began preparing for what military pilots called nap of the earth, flying, following. The terrain so closely that you were literally flying between hills and mountains at high speed. It was one of the most dangerous forms of helicopter flying, requiring split-second timing and absolute precision. One small mistake would send them crashing into a rock wall at 180 miles per hour. The Apache plunged into the canyon just as the first wave of missiles arrived at their previous position. Sarah heard the explosions echoing off the canyon walls behind them as she threaded the helicopter between towering rock formations with only feet to spare on either side. The narrow confines of the canyon would make it impossible for most of the missiles to follow them, but it also severely limited their maneuvering options. Flying through the canyon at high speed was like navigating a 3-dimensional maze while blindfolded. Sarah had to rely entirely on her instruments and Jake's guidance to avoid the rock walls that seemed to reach out for them from every direction. The helicopter's rotor wash created mini dust storms that further reduced visibility, turning an already dangerous flight into something that bordered on impossible. The mysterious woman's voice followed them into the canyon, somehow still coming through clearly despite the interference from the rock walls. "Excellent tactics, Captain. You're using the terrain exactly as we predicted you would, but every tactical advantage can be turned into a disadvantage by someone who thinks ahead." Sarah didn't like the sound of that. If their enemies had anticipated her move into the canyon, it meant they had prepared for it. She began looking for alternative escape routes while maintaining their high-speed flight through the narrow passage. Jake was doing the same from his position, scanning for threats ahead while keeping track of their exact position relative to the canyon walls. That's when they saw it. Ahead of them, where the canyon opened into a broader valley, vehicles were positioned on both sides of the exit. The enemy had indeed anticipated their route and set up an ambush at the only way out. Worse, Sarah could see the distinctive shapes of portable surface-to-air missile launchers being positioned to cover the canyon exit. They were flying directly into a trap at 180 miles per hour with nowhere to turn around. The canyon walls were too narrow to allow the Apache to reverse direction, and slowing down would make them an easy target for the missiles that were undoubtedly still tracking them from behind. Sarah had to make another impossible decision in a situation where all the options seemed to lead to disaster. Jake's calm voice cut through her racing thoughts. "Sarah, I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." In their 18 months of flying together, Jake's ideas had saved their lives more than once, even when they seemed crazy at first. Sarah trusted his tactical thinking completely. "Talk to me, Jake. The canyon wall on our right has a vertical fault line about 200 meters ahead. If we could get enough altitude quickly, we might be able to clear the canyon rim and break out to the south instead of continuing toward the ambush." Sarah looked at her instruments and felt her stomach drop. Getting enough altitude to clear the canyon rim would require pulling the Apache into an almost vertical climb while flying at maximum speed in a confined space. It was the kind of maneuver that flight instructors used as an example of how to turn a perfectly good helicopter into a smoking hole in the ground. But the alternative was flying directly into an ambush where they would face concentrated missile fire with no room to maneuver. Sarah made her choice. "Hold on, Jake. This is going to get interesting." She pulled back on the controls and increased power to maximum, sending the Apache into a steep climbing turn that pressed both pilots deep into their seats. The helicopter's engine screamed in protest as she demanded more performance than the aircraft was designed to give. Warning lights flickered on her instrument panel as various systems approached their operational limits. The canyon wall rushed past them as they climbed, so close that Sarah could see individual rocks and crevices in the stone face. The Apache's rotor blades were only feet away from striking the canyon rim, and even the smallest miscalculation would send them tumbling back down into the rocky depths below. As they reached the critical point in their climb, Sarah heard the mysterious woman's voice again. But this time there was surprise in her tone. Impossible. No helicopter pilot would attempt that maneuver in those conditions. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any helicopter pilot. She was an Apache pilot with 3 years of combat experience and the instincts of someone who had survived longer than most in one of the world's most dangerous jobs. As the helicopter crested the canyon rim with inches to spare, she felt a surge of fierce satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anything to mysterious voices on the radio. They were free of the canyon, but their problems were far from over. As the Apache cleared the rim and gained altitude, Sarah could see the full scope of what they were facing. Enemy vehicles were positioned throughout the valley in a coordinated pattern that suggested military planning at the highest level. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a full-scale operation designed to eliminate them. Jake was already scanning for new threats when his instruments lit up with another wave of missile launches. Multiple missiles in the air, coming from at least 6 different positions. "Sarah, I think we need to call for immediate extraction." But even as Jake spoke, Sarah realized that extraction might not be possible. The F-16s that had been providing air cover were no longer responding to radio calls, and their fuel situation was becoming critical. They were alone against a well-equipped enemy force that seemed to know their every move in advance. The mysterious woman's laughter came through the radio one more time, now with a note of triumph that made Sarah's blood boil. "Welcome to the real battle, Captain Mitchell. Everything that came before was just the opening move." Sarah felt a cold rage building inside her chest as the implications of the woman's words sank in. This entire engagement had been carefully planned and orchestrated, with her Apache crew as the intended target. Someone had spent considerable time and resources setting up this elaborate trap, which meant they had access to classified intelligence about her missions and flight patterns. The missiles were closing in from multiple directions, but Sarah's anger was transforming into something more useful, a crystal-clear focus that seemed to slow down time around her. Every detail of their situation became sharp and precise in her mind. She could see exactly where each missile was coming from, calculate their approach angles, and identify the terrain features that might provide cover or escape routes. Jake sensed the change in her immediately. In their months of flying together, he had learned to read Sarah's moods and responses, and he knew that when she got this focused, impossible things became possible. "What's the plan, Sarah?" Instead of answering immediately, Sarah began a series of violent evasive maneuvers that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The Apache twisted and turned through the air like a leaf in a hurricane, but every movement was precisely calculated to avoid the incoming missiles while positioning them for a counterattack. She was no longer just trying to survive, she was hunting. The first missile streaked past them, fooled by a combination of chaff deployment and a sudden altitude change that brought them below the weapon's minimum engagement envelope. The second missile lost its lock when Sarah used a rocky outcropping as a shield, putting solid stone between them and the weapon's guidance system. But it was what happened next that turned the battle around. As the third missile approached their position, Sarah did something that went against every piece of flight training she had ever received. Instead of turning away from the missile, she turned directly toward it and accelerated to maximum speed. The missile's guidance system, designed to track targets that were trying to escape, couldn't adjust quickly enough to the radical change in the target's behavior. The weapon shot past the Apache and detonated harmlessly in the distance while Sarah continued her high-speed approach toward the launch position. Jake understood her plan and began targeting the missile launcher that had just fired at them. The Apache's 30mm cannon spoke with deadly authority, sending a stream of high-explosive rounds into the enemy position. The launcher disappeared in a ball of fire and smoke, eliminating one of the threats against them. The mysterious woman's voice came through the radio again, but now there was uncertainty replacing the earlier confidence. "Interesting tactics, Captain, but you're still outnumbered and outgunned. How long do you think you can keep this up?" Sarah didn't bother to respond verbally, but her actions spoke louder than words. She brought the Apache around in a tight circle, using the helicopter's superior maneuverability to stay ahead of the remaining missiles while Jake continued to eliminate ground targets with surgical precision. What the enemy hadn't counted on was Sarah's intimate knowledge of Apache helicopter capabilities and her willingness to push those capabilities far beyond their intended limits. The helicopter was designed to be tough and maneuverable, but in Sarah's hands, it became something approaching a work of art, a dancing machine of destruction that seemed to anticipate its enemy's moves. Jake fired 2 Hellfire missiles in quick succession, each one guided to its target with deadly accuracy. 2 more enemy vehicles erupted in flames, their missile systems destroyed before they could launch another attack. The coordination of the enemy assault was beginning to break down as Sarah and Jake systematically eliminated their most dangerous threats. But the enemy still had more surprises in store. As Sarah completed another evasive turn, Jake's instruments detected something new and terrifying. "Sarah, I'm picking up a radar signature that I've never seen before. It's not in any of our threat libraries." The unknown radar signature meant they were facing a weapon system that their intelligence services hadn't encountered before, possibly something experimental or recently developed. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she realized that this engagement was about more than just eliminating her crew. They were being used as test targets for new enemy weapons. The radar lock was different from anything Sarah had experienced. Instead of the usual steady tone that indicated a missile lock, this system produced a pulsing signal that seemed to adapt and change as she tried to break it. Every evasive maneuver she attempted was countered by adjustments in the enemy's targeting system, as if the weapon was learning from her responses. Jake's voice was tense as he monitored the new threat. "Whatever this is, it's tracking us through our countermeasures. Chaff and flares aren't having any effect." Sarah realized they were facing adaptive targeting technology that could adjust to their defensive measures in real time. It was the kind of system that military strategists had warned about for years. Weapons that could learn and evolve during combat, making traditional defensive tactics obsolete. The mysterious woman's laughter returned to the radio, now with a note of genuine amusement. "Did you really think you were facing ordinary opponents, Captain Mitchell? You and your crew represent the best that your military has to offer, which makes you perfect test subjects for our new capabilities." The admission confirmed Sarah's worst fears. They weren't just fighting for their lives. They were trapped in a live fire test of enemy weapon systems, with their deaths providing valuable data for future attacks against Allied forces. The knowledge that their sacrifice would be used to improve enemy capabilities filled Sarah with a determination that burned, hotter than any emotion she had ever felt. But determination alone wouldn't be enough against adaptive weapons technology. Sarah needed to do something completely unexpected, something that no computer system could predict or counter. She needed to stop thinking like a military pilot and start thinking like the crop duster's daughter she had been back in Montana. Her father had taught her to fly an aircraft that were held together with determination and prayer, machines that required a pilot to understand not just the technical systems, but the soul of the aircraft itself. He had shown her that sometimes the best solution to a technical problem was to ignore the technology entirely and rely on pure flying skill. Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her flight instructors. She began systematically shutting down the Apache's electronic systems one by one, until only the most basic flight controls remained operational. No radar, no threat warning systems, no electronic countermeasures, just a helicopter, a pilot, and the sky around them. Jake realized what she was doing and felt his own surge of understanding. "You're going completely analog. If they can't read our electronic signatures, they can't adapt to our responses. Without their electronic systems, the Apache became invisible to the adaptive targeting system that had been tracking them. Sarah was now flying the helicopter the same way pilots had flown 50 years ago, using only her eyes, her instincts, and her knowledge of how aircraft behaved in combat situations. The enemy's confusion was immediate and obvious. The mysterious woman's voice came through the radio with frustration replacing the earlier confidence. "What are you doing? Our systems show your aircraft has disappeared from all tracking screens." Sarah smiled grimly as she brought the Apache around for what she intended to be the final attack of this engagement. The enemy had superior technology and numerical advantage, but they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed that superior technology was always the answer to any tactical problem. What they hadn't counted on was a pilot who was willing to abandon technological advantages in favor of pure flying skill, combined with a gunner who could hit targets using nothing but visual acquisition and manual calculations. Sarah and Jake were about to demonstrate that sometimes the oldest solutions were still the best solutions. As they approached the final enemy positions, Sarah felt the same calm confidence that had carried her through 3 years of combat flying. The mysterious woman and her adaptive weapons could track and counter any electronic system, but they couldn't track the one thing that mattered most: the skill and determination of an Apache pilot who refused to be defeated. Flying the Apache without electronic systems was like stepping back in time to the early days of combat aviation, when pilots relied on eyesight, instinct, and raw courage, rather than computer-assisted targeting. Sarah felt a strange sense of liberation as she maneuvered the helicopter, using only the fundamental principles of flight that her father had taught her. Years ago in Montana, Jake adapted to the new situation with the same calm professionalism that had made him such an effective gunner. Without his electronic targeting systems, he had to estimate ranges and wind conditions manually, calculating missile trajectories in his head, while Sarah kept them moving through increasingly complex flight patterns designed to confuse any remaining enemy tracking systems. The mysterious woman's voice crackled through the radio again, now with evident frustration. "You cannot hide from us forever, Captain Mitchell. Our thermal imaging systems can still track your heat signature, even without electronic locks." Sarah had anticipated this problem. The Apache's engines generated tremendous heat, making them visible to infrared detection systems even when all other electronic signatures were eliminated. But she had spent years studying helicopter combat tactics, including methods developed during conflicts where pilots had to deal with sophisticated enemy air defenses. She began a series of maneuvers that used the desert terrain to mask their heat signature. By flying close to sun-heated rock formations and using the natural thermal currents rising from the desert floor, Sarah was able to blend the Apache's heat signature with the background thermal environment. It was a technique that required precise timing and an intimate understanding of how heat behaved in desert conditions. Jake spotted their next target through his manual sighting system, a command vehicle that appeared to be coordinating the remaining enemy forces. Without his electronic range-finding equipment, he had to estimate the distance by comparing the target's apparent size to known reference points in the landscape. It was old-school gunnery that required skill and experience rather than technological assistance. Sarah brought the Apache into position for Jake's shot while simultaneously avoiding 2 more missiles that had been launched from different positions. The weapons were conventional missiles without adaptive guidance, and her manual flying techniques were more than adequate to defeat them. She felt a surge of confidence as the missiles exploded harmlessly in the distance. Jake's Hellfire missile streaked toward the command vehicle with deadly accuracy. The weapon didn't need electronic guidance from the Apache once it was launched. Its own internal systems were sufficient to guide it to the laser-designated target. The explosion eliminated what appeared to be the central coordination point for the enemy operation. The immediate effect was obvious. The remaining enemy forces began operating less efficiently, with longer delays between missile launches and less coordinated positioning. Sarah and Jake had successfully disrupted the technological advantage that their enemies had been relying on, but the mysterious woman wasn't finished with them yet. Her voice came through the radio with a new tone, not frustration or amusement, but something approaching respect. "Very clever, Captain Mitchell. You've managed to neutralize our primary advantages through pure flying skill. But we have one more surprise that doesn't depend on technology." Sarah didn't like the sound of that. If the enemy had additional capabilities that didn't rely on the electronic systems she had countered, it meant they were facing human opponents with training and experience comparable to her own. The thought of going up against equally skilled pilots in a fair fight was both exciting and terrifying. Her question was answered moments later when Jake reported new aircraft signatures appearing on the horizon. "Sarah, I'm seeing rotorcraft approaching from the northeast. At least 3 helicopters flying in formation." Sarah felt her blood chill as she realized what they were facing. The enemy had brought in their own attack helicopters, probably flown by pilots with combat experience comparable to her own. The technological advantages and disadvantages would be roughly equal, turning the engagement into a test of pure pilot skill against pilot skill. The approaching helicopters were unfamiliar models that Sarah didn't recognize from her intelligence briefings. They appeared to be variations of existing designs, but with modifications that suggested advanced capabilities. Whatever organization was behind this operation had access to sophisticated aircraft and experienced pilots to fly them. Jake was already calculating engagement options as the enemy helicopters closed the distance between them. 3 aircraft, approaching in a loose formation that suggests they're planning to bracket us between multiple attack vectors. We're going to be outnumbered 3-1. The odds were not encouraging, but Sarah had faced difficult situations before and survived through a combination of skill, luck, and sheer determination. She began planning her approach to the engagement, while continuing to use the terrain to mask their position and movement. The mysterious woman's voice returned to the radio, now with an almost conversational tone. "The pilots approaching your position are among our best, Captain Mitchell. Each has combat experience comparable to your own, and they're flying aircraft specifically designed to counter Apache capabilities. This should be an interesting test." Sarah realized that the entire engagement had been designed as some kind of elaborate evaluation, with her crew serving as both test subjects and opponents for whatever organization was behind this operation. The knowledge that their lives were being treated as data points in someone's tactical analysis filled her with cold anger. But anger could be useful if properly channeled. Sarah had learned over 3 years of combat flying that controlled rage could sharpen focus and improve performance, as long as it didn't overwhelm tactical thinking. She began using her anger as fuel for the intense concentration required for helicopter-to-helicopter combat. The first enemy helicopter appeared over a ridgeline about 2 miles away, moving in a careful approach pattern that suggested its pilot was experienced and cautious. Sarah could see missile pods mounted under its stub wings, along with what appeared to be a 30-millimeter cannon, similar to the Apache's own armament. The aircraft was roughly comparable to her own in terms of firepower and capability. Jake was tracking the approaching helicopter through his manual sighting system while Sarah positioned their Apache for the engagement. Without electronic targeting assistance, they would have to rely on visual acquisition and manual fire control, the same techniques used by helicopter pilots for decades before computer-assisted systems became available. The second enemy helicopter appeared from a different direction, confirming Jake's prediction that they were planning to bracket the Apache between multiple attack vectors. Sarah realized she was about to face the most challenging air-to-air engagement of her career, against opponents who were specifically prepared to counter her tactics and capabilities. The third helicopter remained hidden, probably positioning itself for a surprise attack once the initial engagement began. Sarah made mental notes of likely hiding positions while planning her own attack approach. The key to surviving against multiple opponents was to engage them individually, rather than allowing them to coordinate their attacks effectively. As the range closed to engagement distance, Sarah felt the familiar calm focus that came over her during critical moments in combat. The next few minutes would determine whether she and Jake survived to tell the story of this strange encounter, or whether they became another casualty in someone else's tactical experiment. The mysterious woman's voice came through the radio one final time before the engagement began. "Good luck, Captain Mitchell. You're going to need it." But Sarah Mitchell had never relied on luck to survive combat. She had trained, studied, and practiced until her skills were honed to a razor's edge. As she prepared to engage 3 enemy helicopters in aerial combat, she felt confident that training and determination would be enough to see them through whatever came next. The first enemy helicopter opened fire while still at maximum range, launching 2 missiles in Sarah's direction. The pilot was either inexperienced or overconfident, firing from a distance that gave Sarah plenty of time to react and maneuver. She smiled grimly as she threw the Apache into a diving turn that used a rocky outcropping as cover, while simultaneously closing the distance to her attacker. Jake was ready, with return fire the moment they cleared the rocks. His manually aimed Hellfire missile streaked toward the enemy helicopter with deadly precision. The opposing pilot tried to evade, but Jake's years of experience showed as his weapon found its target. The enemy aircraft erupted in a ball of fire and twisted metal that tumbled toward the desert floor. First one down, Jake reported calmly, already scanning for the second helicopter while Sarah continued her aggressive maneuvering. The destruction of their teammates seemed to surprise the remaining enemy pilots, and Sarah could hear excited chatter in a foreign language coming through her radio. They had expected the engagement to be more evenly matched, and the quick elimination of one of their aircraft was forcing them to reconsider their tactics. But the second pilot was more experienced than the first. Instead of engaging at long range, he used the terrain to mask his approach and appeared suddenly from behind a ridgeline at close range. Sarah barely had time to react as missiles streaked toward the Apache from less than a mile away. The close-range engagement meant that traditional evasive maneuvers wouldn't be enough. Sarah pulled the Apache into a maneuver that pushed both the aircraft and her own physical limits, a barrel roll that brought them inverted while simultaneously diving toward the ground at maximum speed. It was a move that most helicopter pilots would consider suicidal. But Sarah's years of flying, everything from crop dusters to military aircraft, gave her the confidence to attempt it. The missiles shot past their inverted position as Sarah rolled the Apache back to level flight just feet above the desert floor. Jake was fighting against the extreme G-forces to maintain sight of their attacker while Sarah used their ultra-low altitude to stay below the enemy's targeting solutions. Flying at high speed just above the ground was one of the most dangerous things a helicopter pilot could attempt, but it also provided tactical advantages that Sarah exploited ruthlessly. The enemy pilot couldn't get a clean shot without risking his own aircraft in the ground clutter, while Sarah's low altitude made her Apache extremely difficult to track visually. Jake found an opportunity and took it, firing their 30mm cannon in a long burst that walked rounds across the enemy helicopter's position. The enemy pilot tried to climb away from the ground fire, but Jake's aim was true. The cannon rounds tore through the helicopter's engine compartment, and Sarah watched with satisfaction as her second opponent auto-rotated to a hard landing in the desert. 2 down, Jake announced, but his voice carried a note of concern. Sarah, I've lost track of the third helicopter. He could be anywhere. The third enemy pilot had been smart enough to stay hidden while his teammates engaged the Apache, probably studying Sarah's tactics and looking for weaknesses to exploit. Now he had the advantage of surprise. While Sarah and Jake were dealing with the stress and ammunition expenditure of the previous engagements, Sarah climbed away from the desert floor while scanning the sky for any sign of their remaining opponent. The mysterious woman's voice came through the radio again, now with grudging admiration. Impressive flying, Captain Mitchell. But our best pilot has been saving himself for last. He studied your techniques and believes he has identified your weaknesses. The implied threat sent a chill down Sarah's spine. If the enemy's best pilot had been watching her tactics during the previous engagements, he would have had time to plan countermeasures for her preferred maneuvers. She would be fighting an opponent who knew her strengths and weaknesses better than she knew his. Jake's warning tone sounded just as Sarah spotted movement on her peripheral vision. The third helicopter appeared from a direction she hadn't been watching, having used the sun's position to mask his approach. Worse, he was already in an optimal firing position with missiles armed and ready. Sarah threw the Apache into the most violent, evasive maneuver she could manage, but she knew it wasn't going to be enough. The enemy pilot had planned this engagement perfectly, positioning himself for a shot that would be almost impossible to evade. She could see the missiles launching from his aircraft as she desperately tried to get out of their engagement envelope. What happened next surprised everyone involved, including Sarah herself. Instead of trying to outrun or outmaneuver the missiles, she did something that went against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. She turned directly toward the approaching weapons and accelerated to maximum speed, closing the distance between herself and the missiles as rapidly as possible. The missiles were designed to track targets that were trying to escape, and their guidance systems couldn't adjust quickly enough to a target that was approaching them at high speed. Both weapons shot past the Apache without detonating, their proximity fuses confused by the unexpected approach angle. But Sarah's maneuver had an additional purpose beyond missile evasion. By accelerating directly toward the enemy helicopter, she had closed the distance between them to point-blank range. Jake immediately took advantage of their position, engaging the enemy aircraft with their 30mm cannon at a range where missing was nearly impossible. The enemy pilot was skilled enough to realize his danger and began evasive maneuvers of his own, but he was now fighting from a disadvantaged position. Sarah stayed with him through a series of increasingly desperate turns and climbs, her superior knowledge of Apache capabilities allowing her to anticipate his moves. The engagement became a deadly aerial dance, with both helicopters pushing their aircraft to the limits of performance, while their pilots sought any advantage that might turn the tide of battle. Sarah found herself admiring her opponent's skill even as she tried to kill him. He was clearly an experienced combat pilot who knew how to get the most out of his aircraft. Jake was having difficulty getting a clear shot as both helicopters maneuvered violently through the sky. The close-range engagement meant that any mistake could be fatal for either aircraft, and both pilots were flying with the desperate precision that came from knowing their lives depended on their next decision. It was Sarah's years of flying different types of aircraft that finally gave her the edge she needed. Her experience with crop dusters had taught her to fly in conditions and at altitudes that military pilots normally avoided, and she used that knowledge to force the engagement into a flight regime where her opponent was less comfortable. She brought the Apache down to treetop level, flying between rocky outcroppings and using the terrain in ways that pushed the limits of what was possible in a helicopter. Her opponent tried to follow, but his heavier aircraft wasn't as maneuverable in the confined spaces that Sarah was using to her advantage. Jake finally got the shot he needed when the enemy pilot tried to climb away from the dangerous low-level flight. A single Hellfire missile ended the engagement, turning the third enemy helicopter into a fireball that lit up the desert sky. As the wreckage settled to the ground, Sarah felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and elation. They had survived an engagement against overwhelming odds, defeating enemies who had been specifically prepared to counter Apache capabilities. But she knew their troubles were far from over. The mysterious woman's voice came through the radio one final time, now with a tone of cold respect. "Exceptional performance, Captain Mitchell. You and your gunner have provided valuable data for our future operations. But this engagement was only the beginning of what's coming for you and your military." The transmission cut off, leaving Sarah and Jake alone in the desert sky with the burning wreckage of their enemies scattered across the landscape below them. They had won this battle, but Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that they had also revealed their capabilities to an opponent who would use that knowledge against them in future encounters. The silence that followed the mysterious woman's final transmission was almost deafening after hours of combat radio chatter and weapons fire. Sarah found herself scanning the empty sky around them, half expecting another wave of attackers to appear from the desert landscape below. But the threat warning systems that she had reactivated showed nothing but clear airspace in all directions. Jake was conducting a systematic damage assessment of their Apache while Sarah established contact with their command base. Despite the intensity of the engagement, their helicopter had sustained remarkably little damage. A few bullet holes in non-critical areas, some scoring on the armor plating from missile fragments, and elevated engine temperatures from the extreme maneuvering, but nothing that affected their flight capabilities. The radio crackled to life as Sarah finally reached their operations center. The voice of Colonel James Harrison, their squadron commander, came through with barely controlled relief. "Apache 17, we lost contact with you over 2 hours ago. What's your status?" Sarah took a deep breath before responding, knowing that her report would sound almost impossible to believe. "Apache 17 reporting mission complete, sir. We encountered a significant enemy force equipped with advanced weapons and aircraft. All enemy units have been neutralized, but we need immediate intelligence analysis of what we faced out here." There was a long pause before Colonel Harrison responded, and Sarah could hear background chatter as other personnel gathered around the radio. "Apache 17, please repeat your last transmission. Did you say you engaged enemy aircraft?" Jake answered this time, his calm voice lending credibility to their incredible story. "Affirmative, sir. 3 enemy helicopters engaged us in aerial combat, All three were destroyed. We also eliminated multiple ground-based missile systems and support vehicles. Recommend immediate investigation of the area for intelligence gathering. The response came quickly this time, with urgency replacing the initial disbelief. Apache 17, maintain your current position and await escort. We're launching immediate search and rescue along with intelligence teams. Do not approach any remaining enemy positions. Sarah acknowledged the order while continuing to circle the battlefield at a safe altitude. Below them, smoke columns marked the positions where enemy vehicles and aircraft had been destroyed during the engagement. The entire area looked like a war zone, which in many ways it had become over the past few hours. As they waited for backup to arrive, Sarah found herself thinking about the mysterious woman who had orchestrated the entire engagement. The level of planning and resources required for such an operation suggested a sophisticated enemy organization with access to advanced technology and detailed intelligence about Allied military operations. The implications were disturbing on multiple levels. Jake voiced what they were both thinking. Sarah, whoever was behind this, knew our mission parameters, our aircraft capabilities, and probably our personal service records. That kind of information doesn't just leak out by accident. The possibility of a security breach at the highest levels of their military organization was something that Sarah didn't want to contemplate, but the evidence was difficult to ignore. The enemy had been too well prepared, too knowledgeable about their tactics and capabilities, for this to have been a chance encounter. The first F-16 fighters appeared on the horizon within 20 minutes, providing air cover while search and rescue helicopters approached the battlefield. Sarah felt a wave of relief as friendly forces arrived to secure the area and begin the process of understanding what had happened during their engagement. Colonel Harrison's voice came through the radio, again as the rescue helicopters landed near the scattered wreckage. Apache 17. Preliminary reconnaissance confirms multiple destroyed enemy vehicles and aircraft. Intelligence teams are on the ground collecting evidence. Prepare for immediate debriefing upon your return to base. As they flew back toward their home base, Sarah found herself replaying the engagement in her mind, looking for clues about their enemy's identity and capabilities. The advanced adaptive targeting system, the modified aircraft, and the sophisticated coordination all pointed to an enemy organization with resources comparable to a national military. But it was the mysterious woman's final words that troubled Sarah the most. The reference to future operations suggested that this engagement had been a test or demonstration rather than an isolated attack. If that was true, then she and Jake had unknowingly participated in an enemy evaluation of Allied capabilities, providing valuable intelligence that could be used against them in future conflicts. Jake was thinking along similar lines. If they were testing our responses and capabilities, then they got a pretty good look at what an Apache crew can do under pressure. That information could be used to develop countermeasures for future engagements. The thought that their successful defense might ultimately benefit their enemies was deeply frustrating. But Sarah knew that they had done exactly what they were trained to do. When faced with superior numbers and advanced technology, they had relied on their skills, training, and determination to survive and complete their mission. Landing back at their base felt surreal after the intensity of combat. Ground crews rushed to inspect their Apache while intelligence officers prepared for immediate debriefing sessions. Sarah and Jake would spend the next several hours recounting every detail of their engagement, providing information that would be analyzed by specialists throughout their military organization. Colonel Harrison met them as they shut down their aircraft, his expression mixing relief with concern. Outstanding work out there, both of you, but I need to know everything that happened, especially about that woman's voice you reported. Intelligence is very interested in any details you can provide. As they walked toward the debriefing room, Sarah caught sight of several men in civilian clothes who were obviously intelligence analysts or possibly representatives from higher levels of government. The presence of such high-level interest confirmed her suspicion that their engagement had implications far beyond a simple combat mission. The debriefing lasted for 6 hours, with Sarah and Jake recounting every detail of their experience multiple times for different groups of analysts and officers. The mysterious woman's transmissions were of particular interest, with linguists and intelligence specialists analyzing the recordings for any clues about her identity or organizational affiliation. By the time they were finally released from debriefing, the sun was setting over the desert base. Sarah felt emotionally and physically drained from the combination of combat stress and intensive questioning, but she also felt a deep sense of satisfaction at having survived such a challenging encounter. Jake found her sitting on the steps outside their squadron building, looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the clear desert sky. "Penny for your thoughts," he said as he sat down beside her. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I keep thinking about what she said at the end. About this being the beginning of something bigger. Part of me wonders if we're going to face that voice again someday." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe we will. But if we do, at least we know we can handle whatever they throw at us. Today proved that no matter how advanced their technology gets, there's still no substitute for a skilled pilot and a good gunner working together." Sarah smiled for the first time since the engagement began that morning. "You know what, Jake? I think you're right. Let them come with their adaptive systems and mystery voices. We'll show them again that an Apache crew doesn't go down without a fight." As they sat together under the stars, Sarah felt confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, she and Jake were ready to face them. The mysterious woman had called their encounter a test, but from Sarah's perspective, it had been something more important, a confirmation that skill, courage, and determination could overcome any technological advantage. The attack on the Apache pilot had failed, and her laughter over the radio as the missiles fired had turned into respectful acknowledgement of superior airmanship. For Sarah Mitchell, that was victory enough.